Hello, I'm Joshua Farnsworth and welcome to my traditional woodworking school here in Earlysville, Virginia. And in this video, I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for rehabbing antique mortising gauges and marking gauges. So I have a lot of students come through here, and one of the things that is super important is that tools are tuned up and they work really well. So one of those things that's super important is to have accurate and sharp marking gauges and mortising gauges. And when they fail in a class, it's a little bit embarrassing, or when they're not properly tuned up. So I've spent a lot of time going through a lot of these antique marking gauges and mortising gauges to tune them up. So I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned as I've rehabbed a whole bunch of these. Maybe in the comments below you can share some tips and ideas that you've got. So let's look and see what the difference between a marking gauge and a mortising gauge is. So this is a mortising gauge. You can see that it has two pins or cutters, and it has an adjustable fence that slides back and forth. And the type I really like the best are the ones that have this adjustable mechanism here, this screw that adjusts the teeth further, forward and backwards, closer together and further apart, and then you can lock in your setting like this. So when I find these, I once found a whole box of these for 20 bucks, and that's a lot of them were in here. A lot of them are these that you see here. And so this is a good prime style of candidate. And these over here on this side are marking gauges. They just have one pin or one cutter, as you can see here. The difference between these two styles of marking gauges is one of them is a cutter or a slicing gauge, and the other one is a pin gauge. Now sometimes the pin is more useful, for example, when you're using really highly grained wood with a big wide grain like oak or some pines. But for the most part, with a lot of the hardwoods, you want more of a cutter like this. But what if you can't afford something like this? Well, one of the things you can do is take this style of cutter, the pin style cutter, and take a file to it and shape it so that you have a nice flat back on the outside and then a curved blade on the front side. And that way you can basically change a cheap marking gauge like this into something a little bit nicer like this. And it'll give you nice crisp cut lines. And that's kind of the sharpening. But what if you run into some other issues? Let's take a little bit closer look. A little bit closer. I'm going to take both cameras right in tight so you can see some other common problems that you face when you're trying to rehab some of these. Some of them are not fixable, but for the most part I've found that I can usually get a lot of these up and running again and have them work really well. So here's a prime candidate. A lot of people would probably look at this and say, oh, this has got one of the pins filed down, broken off or filed down. I'm just going to turn this into a marking gauge. But I'm here to tell you that you can actually turn it back into a mortising gauge, or you can keep using it as a mortising gauge. And I hope you can see these details. But the first thing you want to do is undo this screw right here. If it's on the one that's broken is this outside cutter, this will just unscrew. I'll try to do this here so you can see it. And this part will come out. And this, we just flip it around and bang that through here, bang the back through, and it will come out, and we can then put it back in and sharpen it. And let me try and do that. Okay, so you can see I've got this here on my little anvil. So I'm going to flip this over because I want to punch it back through that way, and I'll just leave the pin spot hanging over where I want it to eject, because you don't want it to hit it into the anvil, because that will not work. My anvil's a little shaky because I don't have it attached very well here. I'm going to take something like a nail or a little awl that you don't mind resharpening. You can just start to punch it through that brass. You can see it's starting to come through on the other side. I don't know if you can see that. You don't want to go too far because you don't want it to be too big or it won't cut very well. Let me give it a couple more taps. Ooh. And you can see this isn't terribly difficult. Maybe one more. There we go. I think that should work. If you can see, standing a little proud there. I think I bent this brass a little bit, so I'm going to flatten it down a little bit more. Brass is very soft, so it'll bend quite easily. Just don't break it. Okay, so now we can put this back in. See, we're going to slide it in there. Then put this screw back in, if I can get it. These screwdrivers work wonders, by the way. And I'll talk a little bit about them in another video. Okay, oop. All right, so now what we'll do, as I mentioned before, you can go and file these to a point. So I'm going to go do that right now. All right, we've gone really macro now. So one of the two types of files you can use, you could use a triangular soft file. But that's what you got. But I like these safety files. You can see the face here is safe, and on this edge it's got the file, and if you flip it around, the face has a file, and on the edge it's safe. It's not a huge deal if you use the other type of file, and this still leaves some scratch marks on the brass, but that's okay. Now typically on the marking gauges, I like to try and leave the flat on the outside and round it around, but with these they're just so fine that I just try to come at it from both sides and create a knife's edge. So if you can see that, and I do try to kind of give it a little bit of a taper, kind of a round arc, just to make sure that it's all being turned into an edge. You can see the safety one still leaves some scratches, but that's okay. And boy, it's a good idea to use a magnifying glass. I'm having a little bit of a hard time seeing so close because, well, you wouldn't be able to see this if I was using my magnifying glass. Also, it's a good idea to make sure they're the same height, and I think they are from what I can see. So one will dig in, and the other one won't cut at all. Let's see. It's a good idea to keep a little piece of wood nearby, and you can test to see how your progress is coming along. See if it gives you nice clean cut lines. I think we're about there. Okay, so you can see we got this nice and rehab, but what if the back cutter here is the one that's been sheared off? How do you take care of that? Well, that's a good question. So you would simply unscrew this a little bit, slide that off the back, and then you just start going to town with this. Eventually, and this works a lot better now that I put some oil on it the other day. You might want to try some machine oil. Eventually, the threads will run out and you can just pull it out the rest of the way. Not there yet. There you go. And it just slides out, and then you can take that over to your anvil and you can just give that a tap if you need to raise that one up. And then when you're ready to go back, you just slide it in and put it all the way back in and put your fence back on. So sometimes some of these, or actually a lot of the times, some of these will have a little play this way. It'll come up and down. I found though that once you tighten down the nut, it really tightens that in. So I've never really worried about that very much, trying to get this piece from this brass part from coming up and down. There you go. Slide that back on and tighten it up, and you're good to go. Okay, so I've set this gauge to about what a mortise and tenon would be, and I just lightly set it down and then start to cut. For the most part, that's pretty clean. I could work on it a little bit more, but that'll give me pretty good reference for cutting a tenon or chopping a mortise. Okay, here's another common problem you'll find with some of these old marking gauges and mortising gauges is you'll tighten down the thumb screw and it still slides. So that's pretty simple. You could have probably figured this out on your own, but all you do is you get a dowel, and I think I had 5/16 inch dowel on hand, 1/4 inch will work too, and you can trim it down with a chisel or using a dowel plate. And I got this down to probably 3/16, but it just depends on yours. And you could also use some bar stock if you want to buy a whole bar of brass and cut it off. But I'd say this is probably 1/8 of an inch long, a little under 1/4 of an inch. And you just drop it in there. Might be a little difficult to get in. Don't use a sharp piece like this if you're using a sharp awl or something like this, because it can split the wood and it'll just explode. And I'm not speaking from experience. Wink, wink. All right, so I've got it pushed in there. Tighten the thumb screw down. And let's see if it works. There you go. Tight as a tick, as my friend Will Myers says. So that is another common issue with these gauges. Well, thanks for watching this. I hope you learned some things, and I hope you can share some of the tips that you got from your experience in rehabbing some of these marking gauges and mortising gauges. I hope you can come take a class here sometime in the near future, and you'll get to use some of these that you see here. This is Joshua Farnsworth. If you're interested in learning traditional woodworking with hand tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find free video tutorials, workshop tours of amazing traditional woodworkers, and tool buying guides. You can ask questions and share your projects with thousands of woodworkers on my free traditional woodworking forum. Make sure you subscribe to my regular blog posts and also check out my 10 steps for getting started in traditional woodworking. Enjoy!